I'm very excited to have my longtime friend and colleague, Dan George, with us today. Dan has a world of experience in the disciplines of workforce planning and people analytics. He's worked with Vanderbilt University Medical Center, GE, and most recently Bridgestone, and his accomplishments are far and wide. He's been an inspiration to me over the years, and now he's actually an adjunct professor there at the Vanderbilt University. I believe it's the Owen School of Business. So, Dan, you there?
I'm here. Yes. Thanks for having me on.
Of course.
You tell I was the inspiration, but you're one of my inspirations. So I guess we can inspire each other, right?
Well, we can inspire each other. And I really do appreciate you joining me today, because you have been focused on the discipline of workforce planning and relating it to people analytics. Many in this world view those as two distinct disciplines, but you've been uncommonly accomplished and clear around the value of bringing those two together. So our plan today is for you to take it over for the next 10 minutes or so, and for us to have a brief discussion afterwards. That sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds amazing. Great. Well, I will hop right into it. So just reiterate, again, Dan George. I am right now, the co-founder and CEO of Piper Key. We are essentially a boutique consulting firm focusing on people analytics, workforce planning, and HR transformations. And I've got a few slides I really wanted to work in today, mostly around some of the trends in analytics and workforce management, and then want to break into two aspects of workforce planning that I think most people probably understand, but can really dive in a little deeper to get down to some of the fundamentals that I think really help in this kind of current pandemic timeframe. So one of the things that I've done with my clients recently is kind of have this open discussion on the return to work, or RTW as we're kind of calling it around here, and what are the biggest trends that we're seeing. And with all the discussions I've had, I've kind of broken it into four categories right now. And the first is operations continuity, then workforce planning, employee experience, and finally diversity and inclusion. And I think these is such a fascinating kind of spherical sense of HR, because it kind of covers all the different lenses, but then really starts to address the deeper fundamentals of HR. The first thing on the list here is operations continuity, right? With the difference that the pandemic has brought, with a lot of the remote work and instances where companies are bringing on new employees, and even in those employees that are they're experiencing new roles, they're taking on new positions. So all that has changed, right? All the operations continuity around how do you onboard new hires, move people into new roles, build up their teams, get them introduced to the different resources that are available. And then on top of that, the other operations side is really to continue the development of your resources. So both in training and upskilling and reskilling, how does all this kind of work? And a lot of things that people are seeing right now is, you used to have meetings and used to discuss, but since it's being more and more virtual, how do you kind of bring in that aspect of the remote world, but also kind of keep that same understanding of how you continue those operations? The second piece on here is workforce planning, which we'll talk about a little bit differently, or a little bit in more depth. And the thing here is, as companies are starting to realize that remote work is going to be present for a while, and that even the adaptive operations of either in stores, or in-person operations, there really needs to be a different level of understanding, a capability and capacity gap in terms of what types of skill sets are needed to essentially interact with customers and other employees and kind of just keep the business running. What are the other types of workforces that you can tap into as the customer demand changes, right? It's very variable right now. The third aspect is employee experience. We've all seen this. We've all experienced this, right? The Zoom fatigue, right? Understanding what the employee well-being is, how can managers communicate better, and how can they communicate not just to say hello and to make sure the work is done, but how do they communicate their expectations better? And then finally, kind of the biggest trend that I've seen is diversity and inclusion, right? So we've really talked a lot about racial injustice, but how is HR helping the business to change? And so these are the biggest kind of 4 things that I've been working around with my clients recently, and how to understand that, how to work through this pandemic phase, and then also kind of looking to the future. How do we better ourselves? But one of the things I want to dive in a little bit deeper today is the aspect of strategic workforce planning or workforce planning, depending how you look at it. But the simple definition, right, is the right place, the right time, the right cost, and getting that right talent there. The overall objective of workforce planning is really to improve the performance, right? You're just looking at how do you get the talent that you need to succeed within the organization. And a lot of companies understand this as, okay, great, I know that I need this skill set, so let's just go ahead and hire for it, and we'll have what we need. But there's a longer term aspect that many companies, I think, kind of forget, because if you're not planning ahead for it, a lot of times the biggest mistake people make is that they continually hire the exact same role, the exact same capability or skill set that was present before. And it's very easy to do that. It's not something that many companies can kind of think out of the box if you're just simply trying to refit somebody in there. But if you look at all the different aspects of how talent comes into planning, you see that this graph here is a simple, and I think one of the best ways to show it, right? So you have the timeline at the bottom between now and 3 years, and then you have the desired talent level, which again costs money, on that y-axis, and all the corporate strategy scenarios out there in the middle at the top right. So right now you're focusing on what range of talent can you look to improve on by looking ahead and thinking about, okay, for every new position that I need, for every replacement position, how do I get that next talent level, right? And if you increasingly make small incremental investments in getting that talent, then you eventually get there. But if you stay stagnant, if you stay along the bottom axis, then you really have to invest heavily in order to get up to that next scenario. If you, again, don't invest for year 1 or year 2, right? Year 3, you're going to have a huge investment to get where you need to be. And so essentially, without a strategic plan, your talent kind of remains flat. And again, you're missing that opportunity to upscale to the desired talent level that you need. And the next aspect I'm really having a lot of conversation on is, as we kind of think about workforce planning and strategic workforce planning, a lot of HR is talking with their leaderships about it, and they just kind of seem to think of it as succession planning, right? And as we all know, succession planning really focuses on a few specific roles or jobs that are typically in urgent need, right? And when you look at succession planning, it's typically a list of names, right? Specific roles. Are they ready now? Maybe they'll be ready in a year. How do we think about this? But when you really think about strategic workforce planning, you've broken down those specific jobs or roles into a larger subset, right? You're looking at talent segments. So this, again, looks at representing a larger portion of the workforce. And instead of concentrating on specific names or people and if they're ready or not now, what you're really looking at is how do you further define these talent segments, and then understand how you can upskill or upgrade those talents or those capabilities so that the common set of skill sets across the talent segment is at the level you need. And kind of finally on this topic is really looking at strategic workforce planning as a process, not a project, right? It's something that you have to continually do, bake into the yearly planning aspect, whether it's quarterly, whether it's monthly sometimes, but constantly kind of look at aligning the business strategy with the talent that you needed, kind of to get there. And so I know this is a pretty quick overview of kind of strategic workforce planning, but wanted to kind of have these discussions here today and then get Al's opinion on all of this. So Al, I'll go back to you.
Hey, Dan, thank you very much. And yeah, again, I appreciate the clarity, and I also appreciate the idea that it is a process. And let's start there. And I want to highlight something. If I'm a viewer and I'm a listener and I'm saying, hey, I don't know what's going to happen 3 months from now, let alone 3 years from now. When someone has that approach and come back to you when you put that up, I mean, what's your response?
Yeah, the biggest aspect, I think, of what workforce planning can do for you is create that future forward thought, a plan, right? So you're no longer executing just on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis, a lot of companies get held up with the fact that they're so now focused that when you look at what you need to do now, you always tend to forget, where could you go if you started thinking ahead of time? How do you get there? And it's, I think it's much like, a workout regimen, or even, wanting to read books. You have to plan ahead. You have to say, during this time frame, I'm set aside an hour to work out, or an hour to read, or hour to learn a new language, right? You're planning ahead so that you have to have that thought. And it's the same thing here. These roles, as people leave, as people kind of mature or even upgrade themselves, the organization's always continuing to develop. And if you don't have a plan for how it needs to develop, you're going to be kind of stuck in the same position. And if, again, you're stuck in the same position, you're essentially not competing, because a lot of the other competitors are looking to upskill their talent. So if you're not, you run a risk of kind of staying behind.
Yeah, and I like the way you're framing it in this way, because if you don't have a plan and just running off that individual, workout regimen, in our day-to-day lives, we have disruptions that kind of throw us off. Yet we have to get back on track, or we have to recalibrate and find a new way forward. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I know we talked about it beforehand. You can't share specific examples of your current customers. However, you can obviously share, at least hopefully, obviously, some of the thinking around what data is utilized to shed light on what the appropriate adjustments might be made. Because obviously, with the pandemic, it's a massive disruption. There's new data that's being brought to the fore, but it's, to your point, a process, but that process needs to be fed by, certain data. So, the pointed question, what data are you finding either valuable right now, or that is yet to be created and maybe just the leading edge companies are utilizing it right now?
Great question, because I think that's where a lot of people's minds think right now. They're thinking, okay, if we're going to be able to change on a dime, what information do we need to be able to do that? And I'll first kind of probably temper some anxiety. There are varying levels of maturity with how detailed you can make your strategic workforce plan. And when you're thinking on changing on a dime, a lot of that's probably more in the kind of higher maturity range, right? That's something where you've got your head count, what your strategy is, what your budgets are, you have the data on your workforce, you have the data on what the strategy is, and all that is dependent on kind of that changing data that's month to month. If those processes are all set up, then you can change faster. But what's great about even just having a simple workforce plan is that you can kind of create some better guardrails, but you don't need a plethora of data. You don't have to have 6 or 7 people assigned to making sure all this data is aggregated on a monthly basis and you're constantly tweaking. When you start out, when you have kind of we'll call it maturity level 1, we'll say, just having a better idea of some of the talent segments that you want to change and the skill sets that will begin to make you competitive is really the base level data, right? You don't over concern yourself with having so much granular data that you feel 100% comfortable. Again, you're simply just trying to reduce the the guardrails and reduce kind of the sway back and forth. Because if you can just, again, look at, hey, if we lose 3 or 4 positions in this next month, who we were going to fill them with? What kind of talent do we need to fill in these positions? If you can simply say on a wide scale what you need, then you're no longer having to adjust kind of to the daily changes, because that would be exhaustive and resource intensive. And I think that's one of the things that people definitely have asked recently, because they want, or they feel like they have to, but in reality, what you want to do is just simply head in the right direction. You may alter your course a little bit here or there, but as long as you're not making large changes, then you're going to see the advantages of workforce planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your position on the use of external data and external tools? So when we talk about skills data, an organization can do the heavy lift of, creating their own skills database. MZ, as you know, has outsourced, or not outsourced, open sourced, their skills database. LinkedIn Talent Insights, Claro, on down the line are offering skills visibility in not only the organization but the open talent market. So is that a nice to have from your perspective? Is it essential? Is it something that should be used more than it is today? I mean, what's your thinking there?
Great question. And I love this aspect because I think it's such an important detail to how you progress forward. I think it should definitely be used more than it is today. Calling it essential might be a little difficult because I know, again, if depending on the level of investment that you're able to make, I wouldn't want to say that it's essential and then you miss out on kind of getting the basic resources that you need. But at the same time, for companies that are really looking to make an impact, that really need to change, it is essential, right? Having this information about the locations and the skill sets of these best workforces will by far and away get you a more competitive cost. You'll find out where these resources are, where they live currently. And especially in the time of remote work, right? A lot of people aren't moving. They're not really open to relocating, especially, until we, I guess things kind of quiet down, we'll say. But even afterwards, I think there's still going to be a lot of remote work, and that whole dynamic is going to change. So if for certain aspects, if it's let's call it a technology engineering application, right? And there's several colleges or universities or even hotspots of where this talent is, using an MZ, using a Claro, some of these other technologies to really hone in on where those resources are, how much they cost to obtain, and even understanding kind of what other universities are kind of producing this talent is super key on making sure that you stay hyper competitive, in, again, these markets that are becoming, harder and harder to find really good talent. So absolutely.
Now, embedded with all this, and if we would gloss over it, it'd be shame on us. Because if I'm a CHRO, if I'm in operations, if I'm in finance even, I'm listening to us. I'm like, all right, we're talking about talent and skills like it's a known thing. And you and I have talked about this, that organizations historically have been pretty poor at identifying the work and the skills needed to do that work. So matching the skills, in other words, with the work. And we can talk about capacity in a little bit, but just focusing on the skills, AKA capability right now. How do you think organizations can get better at truly forecasting the work that will be on the horizon and making sure the talent that they have today evolves or learns towards that end, or as they hire in the future, making sure that is in fact the people with the appropriate skills to do that future work? What are your thoughts there?
The topic of, not only knowing what skills job roles need, but then, the skills inference aspect of it. So understanding what, you're inferring the skills that a certain job or talent segment already has or would need. This is certainly a complicated topic. You can dive in really, really deep on a lot of this stuff. There's new technology that I've kind of seen and looked at in terms of scraping job descriptions and understanding, the types of words people use, natural language processing for emails and Team Slack. And by doing so, you kind of begin to understand the type of language that groups use, and you can really dive into kind of the technical aspects, which I think are great because they're developing an amazing new platforms and technology for understanding that. But at a high level, as companies start to kind of look just to get a better grasp of this, I'm all about kind of having those higher level conversations with leadership, both at the kind of top level management as well as kind of the mid layer management, to better understand what is the strategy coming from the top level, but then from that middle layer, what are the tactical things that you're seeing? Because I think I read job descriptions probably almost weekly, for different groups, and you'll see this whole, mishmash of skills in a single job description, right? It'll have strategic thinker, but also needs to understand, advanced statistical analysis and be able to conduct, multivariate, correlations. And to me, it's a funny disconnect, because what you've simply said is you need someone to be strategic and think strategically, but then also really get in the weeds on everything. And there's a disconnect there with the ability of certain groups. Now, a certain individual can have that, but if you're looking to hire talent segments, if you're looking to upskill large groups or kind of larger talent segments, you have to really think as what is the identifier, what is the capability that's really going to change that aspect? What's the word I'm looking for here? Kind of the key differentiator, right? So if it is a programming language, then look for that, but most likely it's not. If it's data analysis, right? How do we get our accountants to better view some of the P&Ls, to understand where they can change the general ledger, to kind of pick out the nuances of our P&L, so that we can optimize our so we can optimize kind of some of our project spend. That data analysis skill set is specific to accountants. So if you say, in the accounting department, we need better data analysis of P&Ls, now you've kind of got a wider swath of it. And you can simply say that we understand that some people have it and some people don't, but by going in the direction of understanding better data analysis and then running in programs or training that kind of moves toward that, you're essentially adding value there without overcomplicating or over kind of getting in that granularity of, well, we have to infer that everyone has these 3 levels of data analysis. That, I think, is where kind of companies have a hard time. And I know that was a long explanation, but overall is keep it higher level.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I listen to you, it becomes clear 2 things. Number one, it is in fact a process that facilitates an iterative discussion, because these skills are going to shift and move over time. And even if we take historical job descriptions, there's an implication that those job descriptions were appropriate and found the right talent that we need, that in turn is being successful, particularly as we have these disruptions. The job descriptions of the past might be only 50, 60% appropriate, whereas now we have to craft some other attributes that are more aligned with where we want to go, which also implies in the second point is that if we take exclusively a data based approach and think that some solution is going to do workforce planning for us, and even this skills database is just going to provide the magic answer, is not a healthy mindset to have. We're ultimately going to be rooted in a process, which leads into this question. Who is in that process from your perspective? Like, who is involved in the workforce planning process? Who's setting the priorities in terms of what they want to look at in terms of job families or groups, and what data needs to be brought to the fore so they can make better decisions? I mean, who's in that room from your perspective?
So again, great pointed question on this, because this is one of the things that I feel like I say that every time, but we continually talk about how do you set up this team for success? And it really is. And I'm a huge believer of saying that it depends, mainly because you have to understand what the culture of the organization is. Now, I tend to believe that the overall owner of this would be the business, but it's kind of one of those things where the HRBP or the HR person is kind of the banker aspect of it. So the owner, it's the business owner, the business stakeholder, it's their money, right? But the HR person is the banker, right? They're showing them, they're keeping it safe, they're telling them kind of how to invest it, and that's where the HRBP really comes into play. So it's a very heavily 2-way, conversation relationship that are going back and forth, and only can you really derive the greatest value when those 2 groups are aligned and in sync as much as possible. And this is one of those things that when I speak about this, or when I work with teams and whatnot, is really making sure that relationship builds first. And once you kind of understand where this business stakeholder is, what their thinking is on their strategy, only then can the HR person really start to help them develop their thoughts on creating the right talent segments, understanding what skills they have, what skills they need. And by doing so, the HR person is guiding them, because their thought, their logics are, usually pretty different, right? And so by combining that together in a trusted relationship, now both really are owners, right? Because both get better outcomes if they work together. And if you really focus again on that relationship, then the outcome is by far greater than any one individual owning it and then having small inputs either here or there. So again, the biggest part is the relationship, then forward moves with how do you kind of create that symbiotic role.
So what I'm hearing too is that you're creating trust. The people who are at the table, they understand your role in being there, whether you be supplying information as a people analytics or workforce planning professional, understand what potential actions you're going to take. And again, to emphasize your point, if that process isn't already created, if those meetings, for example, if they're not already happening on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, then the ability, particularly as this huge disruption in the pandemic has occurred, you don't have that forum by which to have the discussion. And then organizations go to what they've done historically. Well, they go to finance and say, well, where can we cut? And then they don't know what skills that they're letting go. They don't know how it's going to affect the future capability, as you highlighted in one of your slides. So as we start to wrap up, we have 3 or 4 minutes left. You mentioned at the outset capability and capacity, and I spent the early part of this segment of today's show talking about capacity, the constraints on individuals, teams, and groups. What does capacity mean to you, particularly as it relates to the realities that people are dealing with working from home these days? So what are your thoughts there?
Gosh, this is, again, such a great topic as we move forward with kind of continuing to work remote, not really a clear end in sight, or again, getting back to normal office hours. I think there's such a huge aspect for an opportunity for both managers and workers, both. I think they both need to take the responsibility of owning their capacity. With the added stress and anxiety of uncertainty, there comes a larger stress level, which then kind of negatively affects all types of work, your concentration, your focus, right? And many people have kids or other things that they have to take care of. And so when you start looking at capacity, you have to really adjust your expectations. And I think that's where the responsibility of both managers and employees can really look to focus on how much time can I really dedicated focus throughout my day, and how much can I get done. In a normal times, right? You say I can do this much work or this many tasks or whatnot, but we really need to focus on, again, looking at what is a true capacity that is sustainable, for going forward. I try to think about things as systematically as possible, right? I can have 4 really solid meetings, and then I need, 2.5 hours of kind of work by myself. If I schedule more than 4 meetings a day, none of the other extra work gets done. And it's simply as breaking that down. If you're a worker, you need to start to understand when you feel tired at the end of the day, what did you do during your day? Understand what your capacity is. Don't get me wrong, 8, 9 calls a day is almost impossible to sustain on a daily basis. And as we look at that, and as a manager, you start to needing to get that information from your employees, from your direct reports, so that you can better track, trend, and schedule their capacity. Because if you don't, we're all going to end up in in a state where things are not prepared, we're missing deadlines, and it's simply because we've overscheduled ourselves. And resetting those expectations, while easy to say on a podcast like this, super difficult to execute, but it's so essential to kind of keeping the consistency and the kind of the long-term well-being of those management and employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And at aggregate, then we get visibility into the work that's going to fall by the wayside, and then we can make a decision on, how to fill that gap, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Dan, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I found it funny in the example that you brought up earlier, have the strategic chops and the analytical chops, and that's a hard. And here you are. That's exactly what you're able to do. Is think strategically, have those conversations with executives, and also help execute on the analytical side, on the workforce planning side. So, thank you for sharing. How can people learn more about you and Piper Key?
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Lovely being here. Always a pleasure. You can go to the website, piperkeyanalytics.com. Find me on LinkedIn. Send me an email. It's pretty easy to find Dan George. So happy to be here.
Well, Dan, hey, thanks again, and hope to see you in person before too long. All right.
Me too. All right.
All right.
Good chatting with you today, Al.
You
You too.
Bye-bye.
See ya.